It was a chilly autumn afternoon in Palo Alto. Orange leaves blanketed the sidewalks, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth that heralds the arrival of winter. In the main hall of one of the city's most sophisticated buildings, a charity event was taking place. The place was packed with important people, business owners, investors, philanthropists. Everyone there shared one thing in common: the power to change the world. Among them, one present stood out. He didn't need any introductions. Mark Zuckerberg, the creator of Facebook, was there, surrounded by influential people, greeting a few with a discreet smile, as someone who was already used to being the center of attention. But that night, the most striking moment of the event wouldn't be led by a billionaire, nor by a big name in technology. In the midst of that sophisticated crowd, there was someone no one expected to see. A little girl with golden hair, wearing a simple blue dress, tightly held her grandmother's hand. She was only 8 years old and had a curious gaze, as if she were trying to understand why that place seemed so full of urgency and yet so empty at the same time. Her grandmother, an elderly woman with time-etched skin, whispered something in her ear, but the girl seemed focused on something else. Her gaze was fixed on a single person. While the adult spoke about million-dollar investments and technological advancements, Emily, this was her name, didn't seem impressed by any of it. She didn't care about the numbers, the speeches, or the flashes of cameras. What she really wanted was an answer to something her young mind couldn't entirely grasp. And for some reason that no one there could explain, she was convinced that Mark Zuckerberg was the right person to ask. Time passed, and the girl waited patiently. She watched people approach him, talking about business, the future, and artificial intelligence. But none of that interested her. Her grandmother squeezed her hand affectionately, as if wanting to ask if everything was okay. Emily simply smiled, as if to say she knew exactly what she was doing. Until the moment finally arrived. There was a brief instant when Zuckerberg stepped away from the group around him. For a few moments, he was alone, distracted, perhaps just trying to breathe amidst so many commitments. It was then that Emily gently released her grandmother's hand and walked towards him. Her steps were small but sturdy. Some adults nearby noticed the scene and found it curious. A child so small, so fragile, approaching one of the most powerful men in the world. What could she possibly want? When she finally stopped in front of him, there was a brief silence. Mark looked down and saw that little girl with sparkling eyes. He smiled slightly, perhaps thinking she just wanted an autograph or a picture. But Emily didn't seem nervous or hesitant. On the contrary, her gaze was serious, determined. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with courage, and then, in a soft but firm voice, asked a single question. And that question changed everything. For a moment, Mark Zuckerberg didn't know what to say. Before him stood a little girl of just 8 years, gazing up at him with a curious yet profound look, as if she were waiting for something much larger than a simple answer. The hall, previously filled with conversation and laughter, oddly fell silent. Some people nearby paused what they were doing and turned their attention to the two of them. Others, still talking, noticed the sudden atmosphere of expectation and also looked over. What could such a small girl have asked to capture everyone's attention so completely? Emily's voice, though sweet, echoed in the minds of those who had heard it. "Mr. Zuckerberg, do you believe in God?" This was not a common question, not at an event like that, not for a man like him. It was the kind of question that usually arises in temples, in intimate conversations, in moments of reflection, but not there, in the midst of a hall full of business and technology people. Some attendees exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others wore curious smiles, as if waiting to see how he would respond. Mark blinked a few times, processing what he had just heard. He had faced tough questions throughout his life, about privacy, about politics, about the impact of social media on the world. But this was different. Not because it was impossible to answer, but because it came from a place he hadn't expected. Not from journalists, not from investors, but from a child. And children. Children don't ask questions expecting rehearsed answers. They ask because they genuinely want to know. The seconds ticked by slowly, and the longer Mark took to respond, the more the silence grew. He noticed that even the waiters who had been bustling about with trays in hand were now still, paying attention. Some guests had already pulled out their phones, perhaps to capture the unusual moment. The air felt thick with an invisible tension. Not a bad tension, but a kind of expectancy that made every detail of that instant even more poignant. Emily remained standing there, her gaze unwavering. She didn't seem impatient or anxious. She simply waited. For her, it was a straightforward question. Either you believe, or you don't. But for a man like Mark Zuckerberg, nothing was that black and white. His mind was logical, analytical. He had built an empire based on technology, science, numbers. He knew that any answer could spark debates, interpretations, headlines, and perhaps that was exactly why he hesitated. Some people in the audience began to whisper. Some wore amused expressions, anticipating a response that veered away from the obvious. Others seemed uncomfortable, as if that were not the kind of topic to be discussed there. But regardless of what they felt, no one could ignore what was happening. Because somehow that little girl had asked a question that transcended Mark Zuckerberg. She touched on something larger, something that everyone there had likely pondered at some point in their lives. And then, at last, he took a deep breath. He looked directly at Emily. His expression was no longer just one of surprise. There was something different there. As if, for a brief moment, he had been transported to some distant place, to a time he had almost forgotten. And when he finally opened his mouth to respond, no one was prepared for what he would say. Mark Zuckerberg sat in silence for a moment. But instead of answering right away, he did something unexpected. He leaned down a bit, getting closer to the girl's height, and asked, "Why do you want to know?" His voice didn't carry the automatic, calculated tone he usually employed in interviews. There was a genuine curiosity there, almost as if, for a moment, he had forgotten he was surrounded by dozens of people waiting for his response. Emily held her grandmother's hand and replied with the straightforward honesty of a child. "My grandma always told me that the smartest people in the world don't need God. But my mom told me that God is in everything. I just wanted to know what you think." Her voice was pure, without ulterior motives or judgments, just a genuine question arising from the heart of someone still trying to grasp the world. Mark was taken aback, not just by the depth of the question, but by the way it had been asked. It wasn't a challenge, nor was it a trap. It was simply a little girl seeking an answer to something that even the adults didn't seem to agree upon. And in that moment, something within him stirred. A long-buried memory of a time he rarely visited. For a brief moment, he was no longer in that hall filled with important people. He was in a small house in the suburbs of New York where he had grown up. He remembered Friday dinners with family, the candles lit on the table, the prayers his father recited in Hebrew. He recalled how, when he was just a boy, he believed that the world was bigger than what he could see. Back then, he wasn't a billionaire or a tech icon. He was just Mark, a curious boy asking lots of questions. But then, he grew up. Life took him far from that time. He dived into logic, science, algorithms. He created a network that connected billions of people, but along the way, began to question whether something beyond what could be programmed and analyzed truly existed. And without realizing it, he allowed that part of himself to drift away. Not out of anger or rebellion, but simply because, for him, the world began to make more sense without those answers. And now, there he was, standing before an 8-year-old girl who, with a single question, forced him to revisit something he hadn't thought about in a long time. Something he wasn't even sure still belonged to him. Emily had no idea of the weight of her words, but somehow she managed to touch on a place no one else had before. Mark took a deep breath. The entire hall remained silent. People were waiting. Emily was waiting, and for the first time in many years, he felt he could not simply give a rehearsed answer. He needed to be honest. Because that question wasn't just for him, it was for everyone there. And perhaps even for the entire world. Mark Zuckerberg finally broke the silence, but his voice didn't come out firm as in his interviews. There was something different about it, something more human. He looked directly at Emily and said, "You know, when I was a kid, I used to ask a lot of questions. Questions like yours, questions that didn't always have easy answers." Some people in the hall exchanged glances. No one expected him to respond that way. Some thought he would dodge the topic, make a joke, or change the subject. But no. He continued in an almost confessional tone. For a while, I believed that the only thing I needed to believe in was what I could see and prove. If I couldn't measure it, test it, program it, then maybe it wasn't real. Emily listened attentively without interrupting. Her grandmother held her hand lovingly while the other guests remained still, absorbing every word. Mark sighed and said, "But then I spent years trying to connect people. I built something that was meant to unite the world. And still, I saw that people continued to feel lonely. That's when I realized something. Not everything that matters can be calculated." The room was so quiet that you could hear people breathing. No one wanted to miss a single word. Mark looked around as if reflecting on what to say next. Then he turned his gaze back to Emily and affirmed, "I can't say what God is for everyone. Some call it faith, others call it love. Some call it humanity, but what I know is that there is something that connects us, something greater than any technology I've ever created." Those words surprised everyone. One of the most powerful men in the world, known for his logical and scientific mind, had just admitted something no one expected to hear. Emily furrowed her brow, trying to process what he was saying. But before she could say anything, Mark continued, "I don't know if believing in God means believing in a being that watches over us from above. But I do know that believing in people, in the connections between them, in the impact we can have on each other's lives, that for me is something sacred." Some people in the audience took a deep breath. Others seemed moved. Zuckerberg's response wasn't what they expected. He didn't say yes or no. He didn't give a definitive answer. But somehow what he said was even more powerful. Because deep down it wasn't just about God. It was about what makes us human. But no one imagined that in the next moment, it would be Emily's turn to say something that would completely change the course of that moment. Something so simple, yet so profound, that it would leave even Mark Zuckerberg speechless. The hall remained silent, but it wasn't an ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence laden with meaning, as if everyone there was trying to absorb every word of what they had just heard. Mark Zuckerberg, one of the most influential men on the planet, had just given an answer no one expected. But before anyone could react, Emily tilted her head slightly, thoughtful. Her small blue eyes looked up at Mark with a mix of curiosity and something more, something that seemed like understanding. She took a deep breath and, without hesitation, said something so simple and pure that it made Zuckerberg blink a few times in surprise. "So, maybe believing in God is just another way of believing in people?" There was a moment when no one knew what to do. Time seemed to stand still. That phrase, spoken with the innocence of a child, had just transformed the entire conversation. Emily didn't realize it, but inadvertently she had captured in a few words something that philosophers and theologians had debated for centuries. Mark opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. For the first time that night, he didn't have a rehearsed answer, because somehow that little 8-year-old girl had encapsulated in a single sentence everything he was trying to understand. The guests around them were visibly moved. Some lowered their eyes, reflecting on what they had just heard. Others looked at Emily with expressions of admiration, as if that little girl had just taught them something they hadn't expected to learn that night. It was then that Emily's grandmother, who until that moment had merely been observing, gently squeezed her granddaughter's hand and whispered with a serene smile, "Maybe that's why Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven belongs to children." And in that instant, something changed within Mark Zuckerberg. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at Emily, feeling that in some inexplicable way, this conversation was not merely a coincidence. It was a moment he would never forget. The next day, something unexpected happened. The video of the meeting between Mark Zuckerberg and Emily began to spread across the internet like wildfire. Within hours, millions of people around the world had watched the scene. But what really caught attention wasn't just Zuckerberg's response. It was Emily's question. "Mr. Zuckerberg, do you believe in God?" It was a simple question, but when articulated in that context by that little girl, it seemed to carry much more weight. Theologians, philosophers, journalists, and even scientists began to debate the meaning of that conversation. What does it truly mean to believe? Can God and technology coexist? Are faith and reason opposites, or are they merely different paths to the same truth? On social media, thousands of people shared their own responses. Some saw in what Mark said an opening to the spiritual, a recognition that not everything could be explained by numbers and codes. Others interpreted it as a sign that even the giants of technology grapple with the same questions any human being has before sleep. But amid all of this discussion, something even more impressive was happening. It wasn't just about Mark Zuckerberg, nor about Emily. It was about all the individuals who, upon watching that video, paused for a moment and asked themselves, "And what about me? What do I believe in?" Suddenly, a simple encounter between a billionaire and a little girl became much more than a curious moment captured on camera. It turned into a mirror, a reminder that regardless of status, power, or intelligence, some questions will always accompany us, because they are the questions that make us human. The video continued to circle the globe, reaching people of various beliefs, ages, and cultures. But while everyone spoke of Emily and her question, no one imagined that months later, Mark Zuckerberg would still hold that moment close, and that he would reflect on it again during an interview that would leave millions speechless once more. Months passed since that unexpected meeting. Life continued its course as it always does. But for Mark Zuckerberg, that conversation with Emily continued to echo in his mind. He didn't speak about it publicly. He didn't comment on social media, nor did he give interviews about the subject. However, those who knew him well could tell that something within him had changed. Then, one day during an interview, a journalist touched upon the subject. With a curious smile, he asked, "Mark, you've faced many difficult questions throughout your career. But I believe few have been as profound as Emily's. After all this time, is your answer still the same?" Mark was silent for a moment. He could have given a quick response or deflected the subject. But he didn't. He took a deep breath and said, with a thoughtful look, "That little girl reminded me of something very important. Sometimes the right questions are more powerful than any answer." The interviewer smiled as if he had been expecting that answer. But Mark didn't stop there. He looked directly into the camera and continued, "The truth is, I don't know all the answers. And perhaps I never will. But one thing I learned that day is that believing in something bigger than ourselves doesn't necessarily mean understanding everything. It means being open to feeling, to questioning, to connecting." The room fell silent, just like it had that night at the charity event. And then, almost as if returning the question to the world, he said, "So now I ask you, do you believe in God?" The journalist smiled slightly, surprised by the turn the conversation had taken, but Mark just stood there, looking into the camera, waiting. Because he knew this wasn't a question that needed an immediate answer. It was a question that needed to be felt. And at that moment, millions of people watching from their homes found themselves doing exactly what he had done that night with Emily. They were asking themselves questions, reflecting, searching within themselves for something they might have never truly taken the time to think about. Sometimes life surprises us with moments that seem small but end up changing everything. Who would have thought that a simple question from a child could provoke such profound reflection? Emily wasn't a theology expert, nor a great thinker. She was just a curious little girl wanting to understand the world around her. Yet, in the end, perhaps it is precisely that innocent curiosity that brings us closer to the greatest truths. And maybe that's what we lack most today, pausing for a moment, questioning, feeling. It doesn't matter what you believe in, faith, science, humanity. What truly matters is being open to connecting, to seeing beyond the obvious, to finding meaning even in unanswered questions. Now, I want to know from you, how did this story make you feel? Do you believe that faith and reason can walk hand in hand? Leave your comment down below. I would love to read it. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, we always bring stories that make us think, feel, and perhaps even see the world through different eyes. Until next time,